Who raised you more, your parents, your grandparents, or someone else?
The candles on the cake were still flickering when my mother decided it was the perfect moment to gut me like a fish, and not with any kind of sharpness or volume. No, that would have been too easy, too obvious. She did it the way only a mother could. With a smile stretched just a little too wide, her voice sickly sweet, the knife hidden behind a compliment that didn't even try to sound real. You know, Sarah, she began as she set down a chipped porcelain plate with a slice of carrot cake on it. The kind I used to love before it started tasting like obligation. You're 37 now. We were just saying, maybe it's time you did something with your life. My father didn't look up from his drink. He didn't need to. His silence had always been his way of agreeing with her without getting his own hands dirty. It was supposed to be just the three of us. Quiet dinner. No fuss. I wasn't expecting a party or balloons or any grand gesture. I'd stopped hoping for those years ago. But I wasn't expecting this either. Not tonight. Not when I had paid for the dinner. Not when the roast chicken came from my grocery budget and the wine they were sipping was the bottle I'd been saving since last Christmas. I didn't say anything right away. Not even when she followed it up with, "You're a good girl, but we really need you to start thinking about moving out. You've been comfortable here long enough." My dad gave a little grunt of agreement, a noise I'd heard him use when something inconvenient was being said, but he still wanted to back it. They didn't know what I'd been dealing with all week. The boss breathing down my neck about end-of-quarter reporting, my therapist canceling last minute again, and the rising panic of checking my bank account and realizing I'd covered their utilities, again, without them even realizing the bills had been overdue. But the thing is, they never realized anything. That was the whole problem. They saw me as some kind of stray dog that crawled back home after my marriage fell apart. Not the daughter who picked up the financial pieces when my dad lost half his pension in bad stock choices. Not the woman who drove my mom to every single specialist appointment when her joints flared up. Not the reason their car, the very one they drove to their church socials and senior Pilates classes, hadn't been repossessed 2 winters ago. "You've got skills," my mother said, twisting the knife slowly. "But you're just wasting away here, sweetie. What do you even do all day in that room of yours?" "I work," I said quietly, picking at the frosting. "Work?" she laughed. "Typing on a computer in your pajamas isn't real work, Sarah. Your brother Eric works. He has clients. Real meetings. A real office." Eric hadn't visited in 3 years. He sent a card last Thanksgiving. No return address. And there it was. That comparison. The old tune. The one I knew by heart but still hated hearing. Eric the golden child. Eric the success story. Eric who, as far as I knew, hadn't paid a dime to help them in over a decade. There was something about being attacked on your birthday, in your own house, by the people you'd bent over backward to support, that does something permanent to your heart. It was like a dam cracked inside me. Not an explosion. Just a long, steady split, deep enough to know it would never hold the same again. I stood up slowly, not angry, not even surprised, just hollow. Like I had finally stopped waiting for them to see me. I didn't shout, didn't flip the table or slam the door. I simply got up, walked to my room, and began packing the essentials. The house was quiet behind me. My dad had turned on the TV like nothing had happened, like I was just going to take the trash out or something. My mom was doing the dishes. She didn't follow me. I think she thought I'd come back downstairs with a sheepish apology or maybe a plan to find an apartment in a few weeks, something she could pat herself on the back for. But when I came back down with my overnight bag and my laptop, ready to go, she looked up startled, like she couldn't quite believe I was actually leaving. Like I wasn't supposed to actually do anything. "You're not serious," she said, drying her hands on a towel, her voice a little higher now. "Where are you even going?" "I'll figure it out," I said. "But you should probably start figuring things out too." My dad turned his head slightly, but still didn't say a word. And that's when I paused, at the door, hand on the knob, and I said it, not loudly, not spitefully, just clear and calm, like someone reading off a weather report. "You might want to make arrangements for your car lease," I said, watching the color drain from both their faces. "Next week's payment won't go through. I've been covering it. But that ends now." My mother actually opened her mouth, like she was going to say something, but no sound came out. My father looked stunned, more stunned than I'd ever seen him. They knew the lease was in someone else's name, but I'd let them pretend it was Eric's, because that lie kept them warm at night. I didn't want to make a scene on my birthday, I added, stepping outside, but you gave me no choice. The door clicked shut behind me, and for the first time in years, I felt something. Not happy, not free, but awake. Have you ever spent years doing everything for someone, and then they looked you in the eye and said you were nothing? Tell me what you would have done. Because walking away felt like setting myself on fire and letting them watch the smoke without ever knowing they were the ones who lit the match. It's a strange thing, the moment after a long overdue confrontation, when the adrenaline has faded, but the echo of truth still rings so sharply in your chest that it almost feels like a second heartbeat, keeping pace with the silence. The night I left my parents' house, I didn't cry, I didn't drink, and I didn't call anyone to unload or ask if I had done the right thing. I simply checked into a small, over-refreshened roadside motel off Route 37, with stiff sheets and flickering fluorescent lights, and lay there on the bed staring at the ceiling, thinking not about what I had just done, but about all the times I hadn't. For so long, I had told myself that staying quiet was the noble thing, that sacrifice without recognition still had meaning, that real love, didn't require thank you cards or returned favors. I had convinced myself that being the daughter who doesn't ask for much was a badge of honor, as though invisible labor somehow made me the better child. But the truth, the bitter, ugly truth that had finally clawed its way to the surface, was that I had enabled their ignorance, that I had spoon-fed their denial with a smile, and now I was choking on the silence I had helped maintain. When I moved back in with them after the divorce, I told myself it was temporary, a few months at most, just until I got my footing again. What I didn't count on was how easy it would be to slip into old patterns, how quickly time passes when you're just trying to keep your head above water, and how little they noticed the weight I started to carry once I was back under their roof. It wasn't dramatic at first, just little things, covering a surprise electric bill when my mother forgot to mail the check, buying groceries when the fridge was mysteriously empty for the third time that month, and quietly taking over the internet bill after I overheard my father cursing the provider for randomly cutting them off. I didn't offer explanations, and they didn't ask questions. It was as though they assumed the universe had decided to be kind again, and they never thought to look at who was behind the curtain pulling the levers. The car lease was never supposed to be my responsibility. They picked the car, chose the trim, even argued with the dealer about the monthly rate, acting like seasoned negotiators while I sat there, biting my tongue, knowing full well their credit wouldn't survive the background check. They used my name, my credit score, and my bank account to finalize the deal, promising, as they always did, that it would just be for now. Of course, for now stretched into months and then years, until I had to start setting calendar reminders to make sure the payment didn't bounce, because I knew what would happen if it did. They'd panic, blame the system, call the dealership screaming about some non-existent mistake, and I'd be the one untangling the mess, apologizing, smoothing things over, and quietly correcting the error that was never mine to begin with. And it wasn't just the car. During the first winter I lived there, the furnace broke down in the middle of a cold snap, and while they sat bundled in sweaters waiting for someone from the county to eventually come fix it, I pulled out my laptop, applied for an emergency repair loan in my name, and had a contractor out the next morning. They didn't even ask how it got fixed so quickly. They just commented on how it's nice to know some people still work hard in this country. When the pandemic hit and my father's part-time consulting work dried up, they didn't qualify for any assistance. The savings they claimed to have were long gone, eaten up by a series of bad investments and late fees. I remember watching my mother pace the living room, ranting about unfair government handouts, while I quietly sent an online payment to cover 3 months of their mortgage. Not once did they ask how the lights stayed on or why their water bill never had a shut-off notice. It was as if they thought the house ran on goodwill and prayer, not the daily sacrifices of their daughter working 60-hour weeks for a company that didn't even offer health insurance. I carried them. Every month. Every bill. Every time they slipped up or forgot or refused to admit they were in over their heads, I was there to make sure things didn't fall apart. And in return, I got sideways glances, offhand remarks about how I never smiled anymore, and lectures about how maybe I should put myself out there again, as though dating was the solution to the crushing emotional fatigue of being an unpaid caretaker and invisible wallet. So when my mother had the gall to sit across from me on my birthday, the birthday dinner I paid for, in the house I helped save from foreclosure, with the lights on because I kept the utility account current, and say that I had done nothing with my life, something inside me simply stopped spinning. Not broke. Not snapped. Just stopped. Like an engine run dry, finally giving up after years of trying to run on fumes. And that night, as I lay in the cheap motel bed listening to the hum of a broken vending machine in the hallway, I didn't think about whether they would call or apologize or even notice I was gone. I thought about the balance on my credit card. I thought about the auto-pay settings on my bank app. I thought about how many accounts had my name and their address. And I thought about how easy it would be, how deeply satisfying it would be to let all of it go dark, to pull the plug on the illusion they had grown so comfortable inside. The next morning, I opened my laptop and started untangling the web. I canceled the auto payment for the car. I pulled my name off the insurance policy. I logged into the mortgage portal and removed my contact information. One by one, I backed out of every invisible role I had been playing. It felt like watching a building slowly lose power, one room at a time, until only the emergency lights remained. And just as I was closing the final tab, I saw the missed call from my mother. No voicemail. Just the notification. 10 minutes later, another one from my dad. Still no message. By noon, the text started coming in, passive-aggressive at first, then increasingly urgent. Did something happen with the car? Why is the bank asking for you? We need to talk. But I didn't reply, because for the first time in years, I wasn't their fixer. I wasn't the safety net. I wasn't their background noise or backup plan. I was gone. And I was just getting started. There is a particular kind of irony that only reveals itself after you've spent enough time peeling back the soft rot beneath the polished surface of a so-called family, the kind of irony that tastes like stale sugar, sweet enough to make you gag, but hollow the moment it touches your tongue. I hadn't been gone even 4 full days when I got the first whiff of it, not from my parents directly, of course, because they were still far too proud or too stupid to dial my number with anything resembling humility, but through a mutual acquaintance. A neighbor named Janice who had always loved to be the unofficial town crier, and who conveniently ran into me at the gas station on a Thursday morning, like she hadn't been peeking through the curtains for years. With a smile that was more teeth than warmth, Janice leaned in and said, "Oh, honey, I hear your brother Eric flew in. Isn't that nice of him? You know, to help your parents out now that you've left." That one sentence alone, so packed with casual betrayal and misplaced praise, nearly made me laugh out loud. Eric, the golden son, the absentee savior, the family's walking photograph of what could have been, had finally decided to darken the doorstep again, not out of concern or love or even curiosity, but because his name had started showing up on documents he hadn't read, and suddenly he remembered our parents existed, or more precisely, that they might still have something left worth claiming. Eric, who hadn't visited for Christmas in 6 years, who sent impersonal gift cards with his name spelled in block text by some third-party service, who once called me after my divorce and opened the conversation with, "So, are you gonna be okay? Or is this gonna be one of those breakdown things?" That Eric had returned, and from what Janice was saying, he was already being hailed as the dutiful son who swooped in when everything started to fall apart. I didn't tell her the truth. I didn't say that he hadn't called me, hadn't texted, hadn't so much as acknowledged the fact that I was the one who kept the roof over their heads, the one who had shielded him for years from the full burden of what our parents had become. I didn't say anything, really, because what was the point? People like Janice already had the version of the story they preferred, one with clean edges and a heroic son arriving just in time to save the aging parents from the irresponsible daughter who couldn't get her life together. Let them have it. Let them cheer for a ghost. What Eric didn't know, and what I suspected he'd figure out the hard way, was that the paper trail I left behind wasn't just messy, it was deliberate. I hadn't simply walked away from the role they had shoved me into. I had vacated the entire stage, flipped the script, and left props behind that looked harmless until you touched them. Eric called me that night, and for reasons I still don't fully understand, maybe curiosity, maybe a morbid sense of theater, I answered. His voice had that same smug undercurrent it always did, the tone of a man who hadn't been told no enough times in his life to understand that silence was not an invitation. "Hey," he said, as if we'd spoken last week and not 18 months ago. "So, what's going on over there?" I said nothing for a moment, just letting the silence stretch out long enough to make him slightly uncomfortable. "I mean," he continued, shifting his tone like he was testing different keys on a piano, Mom and Dad are kind of freaking out. "The car thing, the insurance stuff, they're saying you just cut them off without warning." "What the hell, Sarah?" And there it was. The familiar shift from casual curiosity to righteous indignation, the performance he always gave when he was trying to reclaim some imaginary moral high ground, usually without having read a single word of the script. "I didn't cut them off," I said calmly. "I stopped financing their fantasy." There was a pause on the other end, and I could almost hear him blinking, trying to figure out if that was a metaphor or if he'd missed some piece of critical information. "What are you even talking about?" he finally asked. "I've been paying the car lease, the mortgage deferments, the utilities, the supplemental insurance premiums," I said, each item like a bead on a rosary I was finally counting out loud. "Not you. Not them. Me. Every month. For years." He scoffed, not because he didn't believe me, but because he realized, possibly for the first time in his life, that he wasn't the main character in the family story, and it didn't sit well. "Then why didn't you tell anyone?" he asked, as if the burden of disclosure somehow outweighed the burden of responsibility. "Because I didn't do it for applause," I said. "But I'm done being your silent partner in this lie." The call ended not long after that, with Eric muttering something about needing to get to the bottom of this, and I let him go, knowing full well he'd trip over the bottom step before he ever figured out which way was down. The next day, while I was sitting in the public library using the free Wi-Fi to finalize some banking changes, I got a notification. Someone had accessed the encrypted USB drive I'd left behind in my old desk, the one labeled simply taxes. The one I'd planted knowing Eric's nosiness would override any warning signals. It wasn't filled with secrets, not in the traditional sense, but it contained everything: spreadsheets, payment receipts, screenshots of overdue notices, a timeline of every cent I had spent and every lie I had been told, all organized with the precision of someone who had spent too many sleepless nights replaying conversations in her head, wondering if maybe, just maybe, she was the crazy one. Now he knew. All of it. And I knew something else too, that he would never tell them the truth, not entirely, not in the way I had laid it bare. Because to admit how deep my support went would mean admitting how shallow theirs had always been. So I let the silence settle again, not as an absence but as a boundary. I didn't return his next call. I didn't respond to the text he sent that read, "We need to fix this before it gets worse." Because for me, things weren't getting worse. They were finally being seen for what they were. And if Eric wanted to play savior, let him. Let him wear the crown I melted down years ago just to keep the lights on. Because the golden sun had finally returned. But I was the one who kept the damn house from falling apart. There's a certain kind of satisfaction, dark and slow burning, that only reveals itself when the truth you've buried for years starts crawling back into the light, not in some dramatic eruption of chaos, but in steady, methodical waves. Silent confirmations of everything you knew but kept swallowing, each one settling deep in your bones like a long-denied exhale. When I left that house, I wasn't trying to make a statement. I wasn't seeking revenge in the traditional sense. There were no grand gestures, no slammed doors, no fiery speeches. I wasn't interested in punishing anyone. I was interested in detaching myself from a structure that had fed off my silence for too long. But it turns out that when you've been the quiet bookkeeper, the unseen lifeline, the one who held the crumbling beams together without ever asking for credit, your absence doesn't just create a void. It detonates the illusion that everyone else had grown comfortable living inside. Eric, in all his confident cluelessness, had no idea how deep the roots ran or how tangled they had become until he found himself staring at spreadsheets that didn't lie, payment logs that didn't care about family myths, and a digital archive of sacrifice so mundane and so precise that it rendered every excuse and every denial weightless. He'd always lived in a version of reality where things just worked out, where problems either solved themselves or fell into someone else's lap, usually mine, and he had become so accustomed to that safety net that he mistook it for the ground. But now, standing there with that USB drive blinking in his hand, he was forced to reckon with a version of me that had always existed, but had never demanded to be seen. He called again, more times than I expected, and when I didn't answer, he sent emails, longer ones now, less accusatory, more careful in tone, filled with questions that were trying not to sound like confessions. He asked if I had really paid the back taxes on the house during the year Dad forgot to file, if I had actually made those monthly deposits into their retirement fund after Mom lost half of hers in a phone scam she swore she never fell for, if I had truly covered the dental procedures, the insurance lapses, the heating repairs, the internet bills, the property insurance upgrades, and on, and in every question, I could feel the disbelief cracking under the weight of dawning clarity. He was trying to assemble a puzzle he hadn't even known existed, and every piece fit too well for him to keep pretending that the picture wasn't real. But what he still didn't understand, what none of them ever understood, was that I hadn't done all of this out of obligation or desperation or some martyrdom complex. I had done it because I believed, for far too long, that loyalty was love, that responsibility could be mistaken for connection, and that maybe, just maybe, if I gave enough, they would finally see me. And when they didn't, when they looked me in the eye and said I had done nothing with my life, it wasn't just an insult, it was a revelation. It was the moment I realized that I had been writing a story they had no intention of reading. Eric eventually told them, or at least told them enough to rattle their sense of order. I don't know exactly what was said, but I could guess, because it didn't take long before the texts from my mother started shifting in tone. Gone was the passive-aggressive coldness, replaced now with a desperate kind of civility, the kind she only ever used when she needed something she didn't know how to demand. She asked if we could talk. She said things had been misunderstood. She wrote that it wasn't fair to make such big decisions without discussing things as a family. The same woman who, 1 week earlier, had told me I needed to get serious about finding my own place in the world was now suggesting we all sit down like adults and reset expectations. But I didn't respond, not because I was angry, not even because I wanted to punish them, but because I finally understood that the version of me they had chosen to believe in, the quiet, manageable, accommodating daughter, was the only one they had ever been willing to interact with, and I no longer had any interest in performing that role. I had spent years making sure they never saw the bills, never heard the collector calls, never felt the pressure of the numbers tightening like a noose around every plan and every mistake. And the sickest part was, I had done it so well that they had come to believe that survival was their natural state, that they were just lucky, just smart, just stubborn enough to float above the consequences that crushed everyone else. But I knew better. I had the folders. I had the emails. I had the receipts. I had the memory of every time my stomach turned as I transferred funds from my emergency savings to cover an overdraft that wasn't mine, and of every night I stayed up adjusting payment schedules while they watched television downstairs, laughing at sitcoms and making plans for vacations they had no intention of paying for. There's something else people never talk about when it comes to invisible labor, how much it changes your sense of self. I didn't just pay their bills. I became the architecture of their reality. I shaped it, maintained it, updated it, and reinforced it whenever it cracked. And they never thanked me. Not once. Because they didn't know. And they didn't want to know. And knowing now, well, it wasn't gratitude that showed up first. It was fear. Because once you admit you've been living in a house someone else built, you have to accept that it might collapse the moment they step away. That week, I got a call from their home insurance provider because my name was still listed as the secondary contact. The woman on the phone said the premium was past due, and she wanted to know if I'd be making a payment or if the policy should lapse. I stared at the balance, Not large, manageable even, and for a moment, the old instinct flickered. Fix it. Just take care of it. They'll never know. And then, just as easily, the instinct was gone. I told her to cancel everything except fire coverage. Let them deal with the pipes when they burst. Let them figure out the roof when the leaks start spreading. Let them feel the full weight of ownership, with no buffer, no filter, and no one quietly cleaning up behind them. Because if I had to learn the hard way what it meant to carry everything alone, so would they. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like the villain. I felt like the truth, uninvited, unpolished, and finally out in the open. The thing no one tells you about finally walking away, really walking away, not in anger or impulse, but in the slow, deliberate shedding of everything that once tied you to a place, to people, to a version of yourself that you kept alive for the sake of someone else's comfort, is that the silence afterwards doesn't feel like peace, at least not at first. It feels like the moment just after a loud crash in an empty house, where your ears ring and your heart pounds, and you keep expecting someone to yell from the other room, except no one does, because there's no one left to fill the space where the noise used to live. I moved into a modest, one-bedroom rental on the edge of town, far enough to avoid accidental run-ins, but not so far that it felt like exile, and every corner of that apartment whispered possibility and loneliness in the same breath. The walls were bare. The kitchen faucet dripped. The heat clicked on too loudly in the middle of the night. But it was mine entirely. And the rent came out of an account I controlled, tied to a name I no longer had to explain or justify. The strangest part was how little anyone reached out once the immediate chaos faded, as if they had exhausted all their performative concern in the first week and, finding that it didn't yield the expected reconciliation, simply retreated back into the routines that had always mattered more than the relationships they pretended to preserve. My mother's last text had been short, "I'm sorry you're making this harder than it needs to be," and my father hadn't contacted me at all, which wasn't surprising. He had always specialized in silence as a form of defense, as though refusing to speak somehow absolved him from the weight of the things he allowed to happen. Eric sent one more email, rambling and unfocused, filled with passive guilt and vague suggestions about getting the family together to talk things out, but even that felt more like obligation than genuine outreach. I didn't respond to any of them. I didn't explain. I didn't defend. I simply stayed gone. And then, one rainy afternoon, the kind that turns every color outside to dull gray and makes the air inside feel 2 sizes too small, there was a knock on my door. Not the quick, impersonal kind you get from delivery people or maintenance workers, but a hesitant, deliberate rhythm that suggested someone waiting on the other side wasn't sure they wanted to be there. I stood at the door for several seconds before opening it, not out of fear, but because part of me still hoped it might be someone else, anyone else, a neighbor, a stranger, a mistake. But it wasn't. It was my father. He looked older than I remembered, not just in the gray of his hair or the sag of his shoulders, but in the way he held himself, like a man whose edges had been rounded by too many disappointments he didn't understand but still had to carry. He wasn't holding flowers or a letter or anything that might signal apology. What he had in his hand, absurdly, was a manila envelope, thick, sealed, and creased from being carried in the rain. I didn't invite him in. I didn't speak. I just waited. He cleared his throat, adjusted the envelope in his hands, and said, without looking me in the eye, "Your mother wanted me to bring this." I took it, more out of curiosity than agreement, and nodded, ready to close the door, but then he added something that stopped me cold. "There's also a bill," he said, reaching into his coat pocket to pull out another folded piece of paper, this one smaller and far more pathetic, a printout of some charges, last month's property tax, a line item for tree removal. Even a note at the bottom requesting help with the upcoming insurance premium. I looked at it, then at him, and for the first time in my life, I laughed. Not loudly. Not cruelly. Just one long exhale of disbelief that hung between us like cigarette smoke. "You came here," I said, my voice steady, "not to apologize, but to hand me a bill?" He flinched slightly, but said nothing. I handed the paper back to him, unopened, untouched, and replied in the same tone I had used the night I left: quiet, unshakable, final. "You should call Eric," I said. "He's the one who fixes things now." I closed the door, not with force, but with the kind of precision that makes a statement louder than any scream, and stood in the silence afterwards, not triumphant, not broken, just present. I opened the envelope they'd sent, mostly because I knew I had to, and inside were half a dozen printed photos, most of them old, a few from family vacations, one from my high school graduation, and, strangely, one of me as a child, maybe 6 or 7 years old, smiling in front of a birthday cake with crooked candles. No note. No caption. Just fragments of a story they clearly thought might mean something to me now. But it didn't. Because memories, stripped of context and apology, aren't healing. They're weapons, soft and sentimental, meant to soften your resolve just long enough to let guilt take root. I tucked the photos back in the envelope, slid it into a drawer I rarely opened, and sat down at my desk, where the last vestiges of their digital life still lingered, accounts they hadn't remembered to update, passwords they never bothered to change, login screens blinking with warnings and overdue notices. I took a deep breath, opened the bank's portal one last time, and stared at the zero balances I had worked so hard to maintain. Not a single overdraft. Not a single late fee. Not a single payment left for me to cover. And then, without drama, I closed each tab, deleted the bookmarked logins, and shut the laptop. They had called me selfish. They had said I'd done nothing. They had believed, for years, that I was lucky to live under their roof, that my presence in their house was the same as dependence. But what they never saw, what they refused to see even as everything began to unravel, was that I had been the one holding the roof up from the inside, patching the leaks, propping up the beams, paying the invisible toll of their neglect while they congratulated themselves on being survivors. I didn't need them to understand now. I didn't need them to change. All I needed was to never go back. And sometimes, walking away isn't a dramatic exit. It's a slow, quiet reclamation of space, of peace, of self. Sometimes, the loudest goodbye is the one that doesn't echo at all.